Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Hello, X. This is a very long story that I have wanted to share for a long time, and just now I have finally decided to post this. And while it isn't my first post, it is my first thread. What I am going to tell you to the best of my memory, a real Innawoods with no skinwalkers. Interested? Good. Some background about me. First, I am a skeptic, and have been called every foul name under the sun. But I'm not here for debunking. I am here because of my true love, that of mysteries. I do now, and always have loved science and history, because of all the mysteries involved. Somewhat paradoxically, what really rustles my jimmies, though, is the paranormal. Ghosts, cryptids, aliens, monsters of all types will get me going instantly. And a well-written or otherwise convincing creepypasta will have me on Google Maps for hours, looking for the locations described, looking for police reports, everything. Hell, I even looked for Mowgli's palace for 3 hours. Sad, pathetic loser I am. Second, I love the outdoors, the woods in particular. Was in scouts whenever I could be. Used to sleep in a tent in the backyard during the summer. I took every chance I could to go hiking, backpacking, mountain biking, or even just camping, everywhere I could. I was hiking as early as I can remember, and only don't know because of a permanent injury from mountain biking. I was and am very experienced in the woods. Even though I was 12 when this event happened, I had still been hiking and camping since I was 3. This experience, combined with my skepticism, leads to me being very level-headed in the woods. But what I saw, I still have no explanation for, apart from a false memory. Some notes about the thread. I'm not posting for people to dump stories, unless they're OC, please. I know X is not B, so I'm asking politely. I'm using a secure trip code because I invite any questions, clarifications, etc., and really don't want to be impersonated. Obviously, all names are changed, but I will give you the real location and the year. I'm not greentexting because there are a lot of details I don't want to leave out, and structuring it that way would take longer than just writing it out. Finally, this is all pre-written, so expect quick posts and me not asking to continue. I know, you're devastated. Now that everything is enumerated like that, on to my experience. In 2003, I, along with my scoutmasters, decided to put our scout troop through some extreme camping. This actually was decided in October 2002, but the date set was around January 20th, 2003. We were from, and camping in, the Finger Lakes region. And during the winter months, especially January and February, anyone from the region will tell you about the brutal weather we get. Lake effect blizzards, huge windstorms, and sleet make the winters in this area unpleasant. This was especially true of the weekend set, months in advance, for the trip. The high for the trip was around -5, and with wind chill we were experiencing anything from -10 to around -25. The campground where we traditionally took our only fall-winter camping trip was a Girl Scout summer camp called Bayberry, but we as Boy Scouts were allowed to camp there when it was otherwise empty. Because of the snow, we couldn't get to the camp we usually used, so we settled for a more accessible camp and got to work setting up. We noticed that there was no firewood there, which was odd, because they usually gave us at least a little bit, but we wrote this off as having to change our camp. In this camp, there were 4 large A-frame buildings, each with a tarp covering 2 doors. Read, holes in the wall, on each end, arranged along the compass directions, each about 20 feet from a central fire pit, giving us plenty of room to cook, stack firewood, and hang out. Now, in our group was me, the Senior Patrol Leader, or SPL. 3 other members of my patrol who weren't too cowardly to come. We'll call them Tom, Rod, and Tony. And 2 scoutmasters, my dad, and one we'll call Jack. Tom was the annoying kid, extremely spurgy. Rod was a decent kid, newer, liked talking, and eventually had a good sense of humor when he finally pulled the stick out of his ass. Tony was the newest guy. He had joined the troop only about 2 weeks prior, and as SPL, I was teaching him at nearly all times. He was nice and a quick learner with a great sense of humor, but was almost cripplingly shy. Dad was along because he loved the outdoors and really wanted a chance to bond with me. Not getting into my early childhood here, it's irrelevant, and 4chan is not my goddamn diary. Finally, Jack, who was the most experienced scoutmaster. He was 3/4 of some Native American tribe, and the other 1/4 was from another. He was a big-time survivalist and was absolutely fearless in the woods. After we had moved our stuff into the building, I took Tony with me as the light was beginning to dim, my hatchet, and we went to collect some firewood for at least the night. We found a couple of smaller diameter fallen trees, and we set to work chopping and stacking it. We got back into camp just before night set in. If you've never been camping in the dead of winter, it is a unique experience. For one, the sounds of bugs that we normally associate with camping is, for obvious reasons, non-existent. This leads to the woods being dead silent, which is eerie to begin with. On top of that, at least in the Finger Lakes, it seems to be even odds whether you get a clear night, where even the stars are so bright you can see your way, or with dense cloud cover, which kills nearly all light, causing the night to become inky black. Thankfully, that night was mostly the former, but with just enough in the way of clouds to make it hard to see too much further out than 15 feet or so. In no time, we had a nice, bright, crackling fire, and were cooking dinner on the heavy iron grate that swung to cover a little part of the fire pit. Hard to describe if you've never seen a fire pit, and screw drawing it. We stayed up well into the night, telling stories. Jack and my dad were talking about snowmobiles. We were listening sometimes, and other times having side conversations. A couple of times while we were talking, we thought we heard someone in the woods. We figured it was a ranger making sure we were okay. When no ranger appeared, we just assumed the sounds were coming from branches being shaken loose in the intermittent 20 miles per hour gusts. The sounds were too sporadic and slow-moving to be an animal. Finally, Jack looked at his cell phone and called lights out at around 11 p.m. I have to note, it was a very strict rule that both myself and the scoutmasters had agreed upon and implemented, that the only electronic devices allowed was Jack, or another scoutmaster was allowed to have a single cell phone for timekeeping and emergencies. We kept talking, laughing, and joking, when suddenly, Rod sat next to me. I normally prefer to never sit next to people, and Rod knew this, since we actually knew each other outside of Scouts. He taps me on the knee and leans over. In a very low voice, he tells me to look slowly at an area, just inside where I could clearly see. I have very good night vision, I feel I should add. All those years of camping had developed my night vision, and Rod was similarly experienced. Thankfully, the other two were practically night blind, because when I looked up, I got a slightly better look at what I had been seeing and hearing all night. It was definitely not a deer. It was still too far to make out any real features, but it was definitely humanoid, albeit thin. They seemed to be looking toward our camp, and after a couple of seconds, they retreated back into the murky forest. I still wasn't really worried. Probably some kids from the surrounding areas were bored. Still, I was cautious, and I started convincing the others to head to bed. I considered telling Dad and Jack about the person, but I figured they'd just be annoyed at me since whoever was in the woods was gone. Soon, with Rod's help, I got the others into the building, but I was not satisfied that whoever was in the woods was gone, and I was not going to take chances with the safety of my troop. even if I thought it to be just a formality. I sat down, pulled my chair around, so that the building my troop was in was to my left, the scoutmasters to my back, and empty buildings to my front and right. I put a couple good-sized chunks of wood on the fire, put my feet up, resting my boots on the iron ring of the fire pit. For a little while, nothing happened, and I figured I would go back in soon. Suddenly, I hear a sound to my left. I don't recall what it was. I just heard that it was closer than any sound yet. I unclip my buck knife from my belt. I turn to my left. I see it immediately, and while it is closer, and I get a better look at it, it was hiding behind the vacant building to my right. It is crouching, half hidden behind the building, and this time I was certain of two things. One, it was definitely not human. While any real details still escape me, I can notice three things. First, it had gray skin. When I saw it earlier, I hadn't taken note of its skin color because it was still too far to see well. But this time I saw the light from the fire dancing across its clammy gray skin. It was also hairless as far as I could tell. The second thing was that it was naked. On a night this cold, later that week, I looked back at the temperature. With wind chill, it was negative 25. Naked was a big deal. I love cold temperatures. I'm weird like that. I am comfortable in shorts and a t-shirt in 30-degree weather. But even though I was very cold in all of that, and I was bundled up. As disturbing as this was, however, the third thing I noticed was far more disturbing. It was staring right at me. As I look over, I make eye contact with it, and it slinks the rest of the way behind the building. At this point, I am scared. I have a war in my mind about what to do. Do I scream and wake everyone up? No. There is no way that ends well. Either it vanishes, I look like I've lost my mind, and lost the respect within the troop that I had worked so hard to get, or it attacks and kills everyone. Yes, my stupid teenage mind thought somehow I could stop it from killing everyone. Problem is, I'm terrified. What I decide to do is pretend to sleep. I unzip my coat and pull my head in and zip it back up. If you have ever done this, it also lets you peek out of the neck hole. All you need to do is move your shoulders. Soon after, I began to hear slow, light footsteps coming from in front of me and close. I grip and half open my knife. I angle my shoulders until I get a clear look directly in front of me. What I saw has haunted me until today, and likely will until the end of my life. It was humanoid, with a normal-sized head, but that was as close as the word normal gets to what was in front of me. It was just on the other side of the fire pit, around 5 feet away. It was standing upright. I would estimate it was between 7 and 8 feet tall, and while very skinny, I would not go so far as emaciated, more stretched. Its limbs were very long and thin. The way it walked was almost spider-like, if that makes any sense. Its hips didn't seem to move as it did, only its knees. Its skin was gray, as I had noticed before, but it was slightly mottled. Its eyes were sunken, huge, and jet black. They were also very reflective. In my fear-addled mind, it seemed almost like they were strobe lights. As the fire danced, its eyes would catch more and less light, shining it back into mine. It moved its head oddly as it came closer, tipping it from side to side, front to back. All through this, though, it looked like it never broke eye contact with me. I can't be sure, though, because its eyes were so dark. Its mouth was closed, with lips so thin they don't even really qualify as lips. Its steps were light, and then it stopped as it came to the fire pit. I am terrified at this point, and slowly rotate my shoulders so that the neck hole is pointed up. I could still see the top of its head. It was standing so close to me. Then I heard more footsteps, and my blood turned to ice. I was literally scared stiff. It sounded like it was on all fours, and I was silently reassuring myself it was a deer. until I felt the poking at my arm. It felt just like a person jabbing my arm with their index finger, hard, but it felt like the finger was trembling. While I'm writing this, I can't for the life of me even describe it. Almost like I was being poked that hard by someone with Parkinson's, level hand tremors. Then it stopped, and it seemed like they became excited, because they started moving a lot more. I don't know if more joined in, but there was a lot more motion around me. They seemed to be consciously avoiding my neck hole, so I think they knew I was awake. I couldn't move anyway. I was beyond terrified. The last thing I remember was one of them grabbing my leg. It seized my calf tightly, but not roughly. It moved my leg around, all over the place, bending my knees, and at this point I have no problem admitting that I fainted. It was too much. When I woke up, I was up before the rest. I woke up because my foot was very hot. I got up and pulled my foot out of the fire pit. This was the foot that creature had been moving. When I put the fire out, I looked around on the ground. At this point, Jack came out of his building. I saw the footprints and started to carefully obliterate them in such a way that I wouldn't arouse Jack's suspicion. He went around to a nearby pavilion with the propane grill to start on breakfast. I woke up the other scouts. As they got dressed, I heard Tony start getting more and more annoyed, and suddenly he was shouting at the other two scouts. Jack gave me an exasperated look, and I went to resolve it so he could keep cooking. I went into the building, and Tony was freaking out. I got everyone calmed down, and Tony informed me that his boots had gone missing. I explained to him that the other scouts wouldn't have stolen them. We looked, and sure enough, they were nowhere to be found in the building. Thankfully, another scout had packed a spare pair of hiking boots, which weren't ideal, but they were waterproof and warm. I just had him tuck his pants into the boots. Almost nothing of note for the story happened that day. The only thing was the log we had cut for firewood the day before was gone, and we had left half of it there. We found another log and cut wood. The next night, it seemed like everything was quiet. No noises around the camp, no movement, nothing. It was, however, a very dark night, and there was a light snowstorm. The light from the fire was almost the only source of light. We went to bed earlier that night, around 10. I slept very well that night, until Jack and my dad woke me up at around 5 a.m. At some point in the night, the bottom of Tony's sleeping bag was drenched. He was suffering from hypothermia and was warming up near a heater in the Scoutmaster's building. Jack pulled me outside and asked if I had seen anything happen that night. I told him no, and he started to say that his feet and socks must have been wet or something. I stopped him and told him about what had happened the night before. His eyes went wide, and he looked at me until I had finished telling him what had happened. It took him a minute to compose himself, and when he did, he spoke in a quiet tone, and I could hear terror in his voice. "Anan, we are leaving. Go back into the A-frame. Tell the other scouts to pack up. Sun will be up in about 45 minutes. Please pack up Tony's gear." As we walked back toward the fire pit, I noticed something that was not there when I went to bed. There, burning in the pit, was Tony's boots. They couldn't have been in the pit for more than 2 hours. They were only about halfway burned. Jack saw this and got back to the building to help finish getting Tony stable and warm. We left Bayberry as soon as we could, one day earlier than intended. I haven't been back in the woods by myself since that day. Anyone who can tell me more is very appreciated. I have kept this largely to myself for this entire time. As a final note, I mentioned that I am a skeptic, but I always come to stories like this with an open mind. As I mentioned before, all I ask is the same courtesy. Thank you, X.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.
There's also a Rumble archive as a backup.